Hey guys, so we're going to start moving up to the next section, section 2.5, solving other types of equations algebraically. And as you can see by the notes that you have in front of you, and as you can see by this different little video, hopefully you should be able to see it a little bit easier. But anyway, let's see what we can do. If you're solving a polynomial equation by factoring, okay, there are a couple things. It will factor more than once in most cases, or you may have to use more than one method. Some answers may have imaginary answers, and you can always check by looking at a graph. So let's look at a very straightforward one. Let's look at the very first one. You have x to the fourth equals 9x squared. First thing I would do is I would subtract 9x squared from both sides and put it on the left hand side. So I would have x to the fourth minus 9x squared equals 0. The next thing I would do is say, okay, I have a common factor, so let's pull that out. So I'm going to pull out the x squared, and I'm going to have x squared minus 9 equals 0. Well, the x squared is going to remain the way it is, so I'm just going to leave it as x squared. But as you can see, this is a difference of squares that we have here. So I'm going to factor that into x minus 3 times x plus 3, and that all equals 0. And just like you've always done before, solve every single one of them. X squared equals 0, x minus 3 equals 0, x plus 3 equals 0. So what do I have here? Well, I take the square root, so I get x equals plus or minus 0. Well, that's kind of useless. Plus and minus 0 are the same thing. I get x equals 3 and x equals negative 3. So my solutions are x equals 0, 3, and negative 3. And that's it for number 1. Okay? Easy enough? Okay. Let's move on over to number 2. Number 2 is a little bit different. You have 4x to the fourth minus 9x squared. I'm sorry, equals 9x squared, not minus. The reason I said that is because I'm going to move the 9x squared over first anyway. So I've got 4x to the fourth minus 9x squared equals 0. Again, take out that greatest common factor. So I'm going to have x squared times 4x squared minus 9 equals 0. Once again, I do have a difference of perfect squares here. 4x squared minus 9 is perfect squares. So I'm going to have x squared times 2x minus 3 and 2x plus 3 equals 0. And once again, setting them each equal to 0, x squared equals 0, 2x minus 3 equals 0, 2x plus 3 equals 0. So we end up with x equals 0. Hopefully you can solve these pretty straightforward. X equals 3 over 2 and x equals negative 3 over 2. And that's it. That's the answer for number 2. Okay. Let's move on. I'm going to leave number 3 as a blank one for you guys to work on. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to number 4. So we have x squared, x cubed minus 2x squared minus 3x plus 6 equals 0. Now, ladies and gentlemen, how many terms do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. So whenever I see 4 terms, what I like to do is I like to draw a little line right down the middle and factor and work on the left hand side and the right hand side. Okay, so I'm going to have x squared times x minus 2, and I'm going to have negative 3 times x minus 2 equals 0. And then I'm going to end up with x squared minus 3 as one factor, and my other factor is going to be x minus 2. So then I simply set each of them together. So it's x squared minus 3 equals 0, x minus 2 equals 0. So I get x squared equals 3, x equals 2, and I get x equals plus or minus the square root of 3, and of course I get x equals 2. Okay. Please don't forget your plus or minus whenever you take the square root. Okay. All right, let's do another one. Let's move on to number 5 here. Number 5, we again have 4 different terms. So I've got x to the 4th minus x cubed plus x squared minus x equals 0. So again, 4 terms. I draw a line. Greatest common factor for these 2 terms is x cubed, so I'm going to have x cubed times x minus 1. Okay, and I'm going to have x times x minus 1. So what does that give me? Well, that gives me x cubed plus x times x minus, goodness gracious, x minus 1 equals 0. Well, look at this particular term over here. I can still factor that, can't I? That would be x times x squared plus 1, and this is still x minus 1 equals 0. So I have 3 pieces. I have x equals 0, I have x squared plus 1 equals 0, and I have x minus 1 equals 0. Well, this one's done, and this one's easy. This is just x equals 1, but we still have a little bit of work here, x squared plus 1. Well, that gives me x squared equal negative 1. Uh-oh. If I take the square root of this, I get x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 1. Well, guys, we've already told you what these are. The square plus or minus the square root of negative 1, that means that I have x equals plus or minus I. So there are all my answers. Okay. So let's go ahead and move along. Okay, so now we go on to number 7. We're going to have x to the 4th plus 4x cubed minus 32 equals 0. Well, what in the world do I do here? Well, one of the things that we can do is we can say, well, first off, we can fix something. because my eyes are messed with me. This is going to not be 4x cubed. This is going to be 4x squared. So that's going to be a rather straightforward factoring. So I've got x squared, and I've got x squared. Now what multiplies to get negative 32 and adds to get 4? Well, plus 8 minus 4. Okay, so what do I do now? Well, x squared minus 4 happens to be a perfect square, so I'm going to have x squared plus 8 times x minus 2 times x plus 2 equals 0. Well, hopefully you see easily that this is x equals 2, and this is x equals negative 2. So that leaves us with x squared plus 8 equal to 0. Well, x squared now equals negative 8, so x equals the square root of negative 8, plus or minus. Well, again, what does that really equal to? Well, that gives me I times the square root of 8. Well, the 8, I can actually simplify that. So it's still plus or minus. The square root of 8, that's going to be 2. So I've got 2I square root of 2. Hopefully you remember how to simplify those radicals like that. So what are my answers? Well, I've got 2I times the square root of 2. I've got x equals 2 and x equals negative 2. Something that, if you took pre-cal, what do you notice? How many answers do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4. What's the degree of my problem? It's 4. You should have the same number of answers as you do degrees. That's just something that you need to learn. Okay. So let's do 2 more, and that'll be it for today. Okay, and then we'll give you some practice problems a little bit later. Also, let me know what you think of this type of a video. See if do you like this better than what you had before? Does it make more sense to you? Just give me some feedback. You can just send me a message and I'll read it. So let's go on to page 2 to number 11. Number 11 says 3x to the 4th plus 18x squared equals negative 24. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of that negative 24, right? Move that over, so I'm going to have 3x to the 4th plus 18x squared plus 24 is equal to 0. Well, what does that do? I see a greatest common factor. I have a 3, an 18, and a 24. I can pull out a 3, so I'm going to have a 3, and that's going to give me x to the 4th plus 6x squared plus 8 equals 0. So what does that do? Well, this is a straightforward factoring again. So this gives me x squared plus 4 and x squared plus 2. All right, so now what do I do? Well, we know that 3 doesn't equal 0, so that's not going to be an answer. That's just basically going to disappear. So I just have x squared plus 4 equals 0. X squared plus 2 equals 0. So now what do I have? Well, I have x squared equals negative 4, or x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 4. And some of you need to make sure that you're actually doing these. X equals plus or minus 2i. Over here I get x squared equals negative 2, or x equals the square root of negative 2. Don't forget the plus and minus. And that's just simply x equals plus or minus I root 2, because I can't take the square root of 2 evenly. So how many answers do I have again? There's 2 there, and 2 there, and they're all imaginary, aren't they? Interesting, huh? Alright, we got one more problem to do. And we're going to, but before we do that, let's go ahead and fill in some of your notes here. Okay, so looking at your notes, we're on section 3. It says graphical interpretation of solving a polynomial equation. If you set y equal to 0 and solve, what are you actually finding? Well, the things that go in there are the x-intercepts, or the zeros of the function. Now, why do we say that? Well, because looking at the next section of problems, all you're doing is actually setting y equal to 0, okay, and then finding where the graph. This is basically where our graph is going to cross the x-axis. So, for number 12, we have y equals 2x cubed minus 6x squared plus 6x minus 18. Alright, so what do? Well, I set y equal to 0, and then I solve. 2x cubed minus 6x squared plus 6x minus 18. Now, one of the things that I'm hoping that you all see is that that you can actually divide everything by 2 and make your problem a little bit easier. So I'm going to pull out that 2 by dividing everything by that 2. Okay.
Yeah, it is her birthday. She's 42.
So 0 divided by 2 is 0, equals x cubed minus 3x squared plus 3x minus 9. Now, let's go ahead and do our break it in half. So I'm going to have x squared times x minus 3, and I'm going to have 3 times x minus 3. So far so good, right? So now I have x squared plus 3 times x minus 3, and that's still 0 equals. So what do? X squared plus 3 equals 0. X squared equals negative 3, or x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 3, or x equals plus or minus I root 3. And of course the other one, x minus 3, well, x equals 3. How many solutions are there? 1, 2, plus 1 more, that makes 3, and the degree of our problem is 3. Something that you should always know. Now, are all the solutions real numbers? No, there's only one real solution. The only real solution is 3. But there are some imaginary solutions, and it's just something interesting that you should get to know as we get to solve some more of these. So, that's solving by factoring. Some more difficult equations and factoring more than once. So hopefully this will be pretty straightforward to you, and I will see you tomorrow with some problems worked out from your last homework assignment and some more problems for you to do. Thanks, guys.